some personal involvement in it. Timeline that I'm going to be discussing over the course of my presentation begins in 1903 with the first manned flight in the United States by the Wright brothers and goes until June 24th of 1954, when the site selection for the Air Force was announced to the general public. For context, I'd like to suggest to you that human beings, men and women, have always been fascinated by the idea of manned flight. I mean, when we walk around our environment, we look up into the air and we see these magnificent birds flying, and we think, wow, I wonder why wouldn't it be great if that could be me, if I could be part of that. So it is that long-term fascination with the concept of flight. In Greek mythology, I'm remind you of the story of Icarus, whose obstinance and his pig-headedness, if you will, caused a terrible thing to happen. His father Daedalus helped him figure out a way to actually fly. And he glued wings onto his body, and he flew high into the air, and he was told not to go near the sun, and he did, and the sun melted the glue, and Daedalus crashed to the ground. So the first concept of flight in Greek mythology was not something that was to be desired. In the Renaissance, the drawings of Michelangelo show what, in the minds of humankind, of human persons, the idea of the possibilities that were available to it. And so a drawing of what, if you have an imagination, you look at it and you say, that could be a helicopter, could it not? A flying airship and a single flight vehicle. So all of this in the minds of men and women as they think about flight in context. And so art and science come together in life. We have Jules Verne's in the 1870s writing his fantasy, 80 Days Around the World. And we are introduced then to the idea of men and women in flight. And further into something that those of us who were driving cars in the 1950s and 60s and 70s saw everywhere across the country the logo for Mobil Oil Company, the Flying Red Horse. And if you were in St. Louis and you were driving down Clayton Road towards St. Louis and you came by to Forest Park, there was a huge Flying Red Horse sign there for you to see. But flight soon came to be thought of as a possible weapon. And so we begin to see how getting up into the air might cause some difficulties or some problems. Bellerophon, again going back to Greek mythology, the son of Poseidon was given to himself by his father the winged horse Pegasus, which he proceeded to tame and used as part of his weapon system, himself the warrior, in slaying the Chimera. But in real life, not Greek mythology, as early as the 1860s, we have a basically United States Army balloon force, which is being used in battle situations to try to search out and seek out where the enemy might be. And you have to have an imagination, in a sense, to believe what I'm showing you here. This may be the first aircraft carrier, because this is a Civil War vessel on which is tied a balloon that rises up into the air and is used as a way to and switching up from the Civil War to 1917, the First World War was a tragic happened in human history. And air power or air warfare played a very minor role. But it's something that we can at least remember. The balloons that were available as part of the Army weaponry system. This is a Signal Corps balloon in the city of Des Moines in 1909, only, you think, 6 years later than the Wright brothers. But they were not very helpful when you think of balloons against aircraft, because they were very highly susceptible. However, we developed new additions to the English language as a part of the air power as war power. The word ace now came to mean somebody who was highly skilled as a flyer. And the word dogfight came into being as people thought of 1-on-1 or 1-on-2 or 2-on-2 and that kind of thing. Air combats, air episodes. In the United States Army Air Force in the First World War, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, who was a very noted race car driver before the war, Rickenbacker is considered to be the most highly regarded American ace in World War I. And Rickenbacker had to his, I guess his belt, he had 22 downed planes of the enemy during his career. He got the Congressional Medal of Honor for his work, but he didn't get it until 1930. So there's a little lapse between what he did and when he was awarded for it. And after the war was over, after the First World War was over, Rickenbacker went back to the Indianapolis Speedway and continued his activities as a race car driver, less, but not maybe too much less hazardous than flying over the fields of France. And then later became the CEO of Eastern Airlines. So he continued to work in that area. The most celebrated ace in World War I was a German, Manfred von Richthofen. And Richthofen was in his mid-20s. He was nicknamed the Red Baron because of the color of his airplane, and his squadron was called the Flying Circus because all of the members of the squadron had different bright colored airplanes that they flew in there. So in the sky, you were down at the ground looking at the dogfight or whatever might be happening, you saw all this brilliant color going through the sun. Rickenbacker is credited with over 80 downed enemy, and he himself was killed in April of 1918 during the Battle of the Somme, and near the well, not quite near the end of the war. He's remembered. He also was the fantasy opponent of Snoopy. So I guess one way or another you get some respect for your good deeds or not good deeds. More context. In 1927 to 1945, a few remarks to set the stage for what's going to be discussed later. At the end of the war in 1918, an American general, Army general, named Billy Mitchell, was in charge of all American aircraft after the end of the war in 1919. And for the next several years, Mitchell was a thorn in the side of military men and congressional men and anybody who would listen, because he had in mind that air power was the next wave of the future in terms of warfare. And he kept pressing for the United States to get on the bandwagon there. As to the point where in 1927, he was court-martialed and reduced in rank for his views. But he turned out to be right, because in World War II, it was air power that finally turned the tide in the relentless, no longer dogfights, but the relentless bombing by the Allied forces of the Axis enemies, in my view, helped turn the war. And you had this kind of tri-force. You had three separate air forces. You had the United States Army Air Force, you had the United States Naval Air Force, and you had the United States Marine Air Force. All of this happening at one time together, not competing so much, but nonetheless, didn't seem to be very efficient. In order to you can't talk about, obviously, the Air Force Academy without talking about the concept of service academies. And so that's where I'd like to go next. West Point is basically a geographic term. It's an area of New York, lower New York State, about 60 miles above New York City, along the Hudson River, where there's a big S curve in the river. And the idea of building fortifications on the hills, the Palisades, they call them the Hudsons, the hills on the west side of the Hudson is a natural thing. So in 1778, during the Revolutionary War, for example, the West Point became basically a fortification in order to control the river and keep the English from coming down the river and attacking New York. George Washington in 1779 actually summered at West Point and into the fall as part of his command. So it had that background as part of what was going on. But it was Thomas Jefferson who actually gets the credit for the founding of the United States Military Academy. Jefferson was the first Secretary of State in the United States. He was the second Vice President in the United States, and he was obviously the third President of the United States. When he worked in the Washington administration and in the Adams administration, he was opposed to the idea of a military or a service academy. When he became president, he got to have different ideas about it. And so he authorized in 1802 the establishment of listen to this, a corps of engineers that would include a military academy. That's how West Point came to be in 1802 as part of the Jefferson administration. In the Civil War, the generals on both sides, the North and the South, all were West Point graduates. 2 West Point graduates have become presidents of the United States, Ulysses Grant and Dwight Eisenhower. The United States Naval Academy was founded in 1845. We always had a Navy, but it was only necessary to have basically implement the idea of a Navy when you were fighting the war, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, particularly on Lake Erie, forays into the Mediterranean, the Tripoli activity in the 1830s. So all of this is going on. And so in 1845, an official naval academy was founded in Annapolis, in Maryland, in the Severn River, the Chesapeake Bay. when the Civil War broke out, 1 out of every 4 officers in the United States Navy left and joined the Confederate Navy. Annapolis was actually moved, the facility was moved to Rhode Island during the war and returned after that. In 1911, the Naval Academy added aviation to its curriculum. And so you have here the beginning of this amazing tradition. One Naval Academy graduate became president of the United States. That's Jimmy Carter. But 3 John McCains served this country as naval officers. The great-grandfather and father of John McCain, the late senator from Arizona, they were admirals in the United States Navy. The Coast Guard Academy is a relatively new activity. It was formed in 1876, and it was first in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and it moved down into Maryland, and it came back in the 1900s to New London, Groton, Connecticut, where it stands today. It's the smallest of the service academies. By smallest, the context here is size of the property. It's only a 40-acre property. That's the size of the Missouri Botanical Garden, if you want to put that kind of into a context. And it's the only academy where you don't get in by congressional nomination. You apply, it's open to the public and free application. So it graduates only about 100, about 1,000. The enrollment is 1,000, it graduates about 250 midshipmen a year in offices in the Coast Guard. At West Point, the graduation, there are about 4,600 cadets at West Point. They graduate about 1,150 every year, and the Naval Academy has a similar ratio of people besides. And what you may not know as an academy is the United States Merchant Marine. And the Merchant Marine is another small academy. It only has about 800 students, and it graduates about 200 a year. It is located at Kings Point, New York, and it is the former estate of Walter Chrysler, the auto magnate. And the Merchant Marine Academy did not come into being until 1943. So there was a question: was an academy needed for the Air Force? There already was an Army Air Force, there was a Naval Air Force, there was a Marine Air Force. Why do we need an academy? And that was something that was on the table as part of the discussion that was going on. The major argument about not having an academy at all, and we're talking about in the late 40s and early 50s, stay there, please. The major argument for not having an academy at all was something called ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps. And over time, there was a non-service academy military officers being developed in this country over time. First in Norwich, Connecticut, at Northfield, Connecticut, at Norwich University in Vermont, the Citadel in South Carolina, Virginia Military Institute in Virginia, but also ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps. The Reserve Officer Training Corps really was part of the Land Act, the Morrill Act of 1862, where free land was 160 acres of free land was offered to adult males who would work the land for 5 years, and then they would have it free and clear. But the same act established land grant universities. The University of Missouri is a land grant university. The Ohio State University is a land grant university. And as part of the support and the establishment of these universities, they were required to have as part of their curriculum, military training. And so you have then this beginning of this ROTC system. In 2020, about 6,000 young men and women graduated from ROCT programs across the country. 1,700 colleges and universities have ROCT programs as part of their curriculum. I know personally of a young man, Chautauquan, who grew up in the Chautauqua community, attended the University of Missouri, became part of the Naval ROTC program at the University of Missouri, graduated from Mizzou, but also was commissioned as an ensign and is now serving in the United States Navy as part of that. About 6,000 officers a year are commissioned as part of our ROTC program. About 60% of the entire officer corps in all of our military services come from the ROTC program. So the question about do we need an academy is not a rhetorical question. It was a very important and a meaningful question about should we do something about that. However, Billy Mitchell, now passed, but his influence continues to be important. In 1947, Harry Truman signed legislation that basically created the United States Air Force. It didn't do away with the Air Force and the Navy or the Marines, but it did away with it in the Army. It created the United States Army Air Force. And simultaneously, Truman set up a commission to figure out, should we have an academy? And if we should, where should it be? And this is the first of 2 different commissions that take place over a period of some 5 years, starting in 1948. The original commission to cite the Air Force was chaired by Robert Stearns, the president of the University of Colorado at Boulder, and by Dwight Eisenhower, then the president of Columbia University in New York. And they gathered together a staff, and they sent out what the feds call an RFP. They solicited proposals from municipalities all over the country, and they got to work on trying to pick a site. In 1950, everything stopped. The Korean War broke out. The government said, it's important, but we've got other things on our mind. We'll move on to it somewhat later. One of the sites that was considered in St. Louis in 1950 was out at Weldon Springs. And you see here an image that relates to the proposals submitted by the people for that site. But things heated up, but what occurred before 1953? In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower was elected president. And remember, Eisenhower was on the commission, as the chair of the commission, to select the Air Force site. And so it wasn't a leap to get Eisenhower interested in bringing back that activity. And so so people created once again, basically a second commission. And that began its work in early 1954. The man in the middle here is Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh was on this second commission. The person, I'm going to find it here in my notes, the person standing next to Lindbergh will become the first Hubert Harmon, the military man standing next to Lindbergh on your right as you look, no, your left as you're looking up there, will become the first superintendent of the Air Force Academy when that's set up. But this group began to meet in 1954. And in about 5 months, they were able to make a decision. They pulled together a staff, they solicited proposals. They had over 580 actual proposals in places that said, come here, we want you. We're the ones who you should select. 45 states submitted proposals. Now, I don't know what somebody asked me later on, what states didn't. I suspect, actually, I don't know what states didn't. But they traveled, we're told, over 21,000 miles staffing. They visited 34 different sites, and they came here in 1954 to Chautauqua, to Elsah, and to Principia, because that was one of the sites, that's one of the proposals for the site selection submitted. By April, they had selected 3 finalists. The 3 finalists: Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, Colorado Springs, Colorado, and the Chautauqua in Principia Elsah site here in Illinois. Those were the 3 finalists. And this group of 5 men, they all were pretty well agreed that they should select Colorado Springs, but they were mindful of the fact that they represented a federal commission, and they had to be fair, and they had to go and they had to examine everything. So in my own study of this and thinking about it, I have created for myself for this evening and to introduce to you, my own hypothesis is that I think that the site of Principia, Elsah, and Chautauqua should have been the one selected. In fact, I'm surprised it wasn't, and I'll try to explain to you the basis for that surprise. Every proposal had to be measured against a set of criteria, and here are the criteria, the major considerations in recommending a site. The acreage, they needed somewhere in the vicinity of 12 to 19 to 20,000 acres. The topography, what was the land like? The community, the climate, the water supply, the utilities, transportation costs, and flying training. So every proposal was graded basically along these lines. We need a facility for a 4-year academic and flying training program. We need laboratories, classrooms, libraries, dormitories, flying field, rifle and machine gun ranges, athletic fields, and room for expansion. It's estimated that 15,000 acres will be required. Not all of the proposals had that much room. Some had more, but that was the way that the proposals were charged. This is what it would look like if you were here in our area. You see the river at the bottom, and you see, let's see if I can make this thing. Grafton, down at the lower part, you see Lock Haven. You might see the Treehouse Wildlife Center. So we're talking about going from the river back to Cemetery Road and out to what is now the road to Grafton, and coming up the river road, starting at Lock Haven and all the way up to the water park. So that gives you in your mind an idea of how large a site that was available here. Community. What kind of a community did the Air Force Academy want to, as its proper community, the best place to be? So consideration will be given to character and variety of educational institutions, religious, cultural, and recreational facilities readily available. Consideration to accommodations for parents and friends of cadets visiting the academy. When the committee came to St. Louis to meet, part of the hospitality, if you will, that surrounded it was meeting with August Bush and the Bush Brewery and the St. Louis Cardinals, because that was part of the community. But St. Louis is rich in educational institutions, starting with Washington University, the Principia, St. Louis University, Lindenwood, Fontbonne. At Lindenwood, the president of Lindenwood was Frank McClure, and he's said to have sent a message to the committee saying, look, I'll paraphrase, look guys, this is a great place to be, St. Louis, this area. Because if you're here on this part of the river, we're talking about St. Louis as part of it. This is a great place to be. I have an all-girls school. There'll be plenty of young women to have for your cadets as Dave. Thank you, Frank McClure. And a similar message was sent by the people at Monticello College, which still existed at that time. Now Lewis and Clark, but an all-girls school at that time. St. Louis was also rich not only in aviation history, but and at the time at the moment aviation importance, because you had McDonnell Douglas, the forerunner for Boeing. You had Charles Lindbergh at the spirit of St. Louis. You basically had an aircraft industry here that could be locked into and partnered with the area. And then, of course, there were the players. Now, part of my original hypothesis for this idea that I suggested to you earlier, that St. Louis this site should have been chosen, had to do with players, because people make decisions. And there's some hitters here in this area. Harry Truman is a Missourian, and he's not running for president again in 1952, but in 1948, he's the one who set the first commission up. Stuart Symington is a very important Missouri politician, even in the 1940s. He's the first secretary of the Air Force when Truman set the Air Force up in 1947. Everett Dirksen will become, a senator from Illinois, will become a powerhouse in the late 50s and early 60s. But he's already a force to be reckoned with, as is Paul Douglas. And you have Melvin Price, the congressman for this area, for whom the Price Dam is named, is part of the lineup of strong hitters for this thing. William Stratton, the governor of Illinois at the time, solidly behind the idea of Principia Elsah Chautauqua becoming the Air Force Academy. Tom Curtis, a Republican in the 2nd District in St. Louis, will serve as a Republican congressman for almost 3 decades. Very important, powerful person. And Frederick Moore, the 2 mayors in 1954, the mayor of St. Louis, Raymond Tucker, for whom Tucker Boulevard is named, and Alice Kaufman, his predecessor, both of them solidly behind the idea of selecting Principia Elsah Chautauqua. On the other side, you have Harold Talbot, who is the new Secretary of the Air Force, and we'll speak about him a little bit later, and I'll introduce you to some names that many of you probably already are familiar with, Vernon Pritchard and his wife, Charlotte Pritchard. But there are some players here. We're talking community, we're talking about acreage, we're talking about who are the players who are part of this program. Truman and Symington. Eisenhower. Stevenson is in Illinois. He didn't win in 1952 or in 56, but he was an important part of the national political scene. And his ideas, his influence was could be counted on and was important. Dwight Eisenhower already is part of the mix because he was the co-chair of the original commission, the 1950 commission, which had in mind that Colorado Springs might be a good place to be. Mamie Eisenhower grew up in Denver, had family in Denver in the 1950s. So there is that. So once again, the three finalists. Lake Geneva was, I don't know much about it. I'll say that straight out as to why they became a finalist, but nonetheless, that community was absolutely opposed to the idea of the Air Force. And so I'm putting another consideration into play. Not only are we dealing with acreage and topography and community and climate and water supply and utilities and transportation costs and flying training, we're dealing with affected communities. Who does this decision affect? Talbot said in early 1954 that he was opposed to selecting any site where they were not wanted. And he said, I will not do that. I will not select a site that does not want us. So you have to keep that part in mind, because this is a picture in 1954, probably in early June 1954, the interior of the historic chapel at the neighboring Chautauqua community, and a Chautauqua community meeting being addressed by a Jerseyville lawyer named Duhadway, whose family had connections to Chautauqua going back to the 1890s when they rented a tent there in the Chautauqua community. And Duhadway is leading this discussion about what should we do about the possibility that Chautauqua might disappear because of a decision to locate the Air Force Academy here. Principia first graduated class 1937, built in the early 1930s. In 1954, they're only 25 years old, not that old, depending how you put it all together. And Frederick Morgan, the CEO of the Principia, originally in favor of the idea because he felt that it wasn't going to affect Principia. But you saw the map as I did, where all the land along the river road taken all the way down to Lock Haven became very much opposed to it. So you have opposition there, and you have this is a young cadet. This is a cadet picture of a man named Vernon Pritchard. He ended his life as a major general in the United States Army. He was a lifelong friend of Dwight Eisenhower. He graduated in 1915 with Eisenhower. They were both sent to Texas to be part of the Pancho Villa campaign, driving Pancho Villa back into Mexico. They were there. Eisenhower had Pritchard with him when he was planning for the D-Day operation in June of 1944. So this is an important guy, the Eisenhower. His wife, Charlotte Pritchard, was a Principia graduate, a lifelong friend of Navy Eisenhower, because as their husbands moved around and they moved around too, this friendship was maintained over decades. And so you have an influential person, Principia graduate, Principia opposed to the idea of the site selection being Principia Chautauqua Elsah, and you have a connection to the Eisenhower. The Colorado connection, you can't take Dwight Eisenhower out of the mix. Air Force One in the Eisenhower administration was called the Columbine. That's the state flower for Colorado. Eisenhower was his wife grew up in Denver. He loved playing golf in Denver and in that area. And so you have to keep that in mind as you think through what's happening. So in 1947, the Air Force Academy, or the Air Force, the United States Air Force is created. In 1950, a first commission is ready to make a decision, but the Korean War gets in the way. In 1952, Eisenhower is elected president. He's got traction with this whole issue. On April 1st, 1954, Eisenhower signed a piece of legislation that created the Air Force Academy. And then on June 24th, 1954, the decision was made. Now, this is William of Ockham, and you may know the idea of Ockham's razor. And how do I say this? Put aphoristically, try to keep it as simple as you can. What Ockham's told us philosophically is if you've got competing ideas, pick the one that's less complicated. Or we've narrowed it down to the theories we don't understand. In science, the simple solution is usually the best. Which of these theories is the simplest solution? Well, that would be whatever is on top of the pot. Well, to move that to our issue, keep it simple. Calvert in February said, I'm not going to go anywhere we're not wanted. There's opposition in Chautauqua. There's opposition in Principia. I read an anecdote, I don't know if it's true, where Colorado Springs sent a couple of guys to St. Louis who met the airplane that the committee coming to St. Louis was on. And as they came off the airplane, these two guys started yelling and screaming and everything else, saying, we don't want you, we don't want you, we don't want you. the first, not the first of the political dirty tricks, but there is that. The Colorado legislature offered or appropriated, not offered, appropriated $1 million for purchase of the land. People here were upset, outraged perhaps about the idea that they would have to sell their land through eminent domain and they would not get a fair price. Albert said, I don't want to be anywhere where I'm not wanted. In the final days, there's an article in the Principia Alumni magazine, The Purpose, that suggests some ideas about the role of Vernon and Charlotte Pritchard, the friends of the Eisenhowers, where Charlotte Pritchard is in Washington in the early part of 1954, working for the government, is invited to the White House about 5 days before the announcement is made. Did Charlotte Pritchard have an opportunity to tell her good friend, maybe Don Eisenhower, we don't want this thing here in our place? I don't know. So if you want to keep it simple, then Colorado Springs was enthusiastic about the idea of bringing the Air Force Academy to them. And forget the idea that Tim Tomlinson has that says, you know, players matter. Look at all the heavy hitters over here. Well, that probably made very little difference when the governments in 1950s are not the governments of today, folks. The idea that people were opposed to something and the government would actually listen, that I think is something that had to be taken into account and had to be reckoned about. So, in my view, the combination now of the affected communities, the distrust, the solid opposition of the communities to the idea of the academy here, tipped the scales in favor of the of Colorado Springs. I'm going through my head here in our Chautauqua community. There are only 2 people that I can tell who have any direct connection to this moment, because in 1954. That committee visited Elsah, visited Principia, visited Chautauqua, and there are 2 people in our community who remember that. They talk about it. They say, we saw the big black cars come in and drive slowly up the valley roads and look at our area as part of their site examination. And there you have it. So it didn't make any difference. In 1954, I just finished my junior year as a college undergraduate. I was going off to Connecticut. I didn't know anything about it. Didn't make any difference. Well, look at it. In 1950, the census shows the population of Grafton was 1,200. In 2020, the population was 1,616. In 1950, the population of Jerseyville was 6,800. A little bit more, almost 2,000 more in 2020. The population of Colorado Springs in 1950 was 46,000. In 2020, it was over 470,000. Huge economic transformation of that area because of the introduction of the Air Force Academy. There are some 18,000 acres of land that the United States Air Force Academy is built on. flying fields, athletic fields, dormitories, hospital, student centers, classrooms. One of the architectural gems of the 20th century is located here, the chapel at Colorado Springs. And so they're basically, we have an enormous amount of time and energy and money spent, a selection process that in the final analysis, you have to think, oh, sounds fair. One community, 3 historic districts. I mean, there weren't historic districts in 1950, but later on, each of the 3 communities became a historic district. We have that. And then Colorado has got its Air Force Academy. How you will explain it, that's up to you. What I've tried to present to you is that my initial theory was the players are going to make a difference. These heavy hitters, they're the ones who they move government. But in the final analysis, it appears to be that it wasn't the big hitters that moved government, but the small people, the farmers, the Joe Knights of the area, the principiant faculty, the Chautauqua leadership, and so on. Well, I always liked the idea of the west point of the air. It seemed to me to have a ring to it. I haven't consulted Snoopy to see what he thinks about it. So the Hosmer Williams lecture, this is the first one for 2023. The next one is scheduled for May 18th here in this building and on live streaming through Zoom here at Farley's Music Hall. The speaker will be a man who lives in Carlinville named Tom Emery. He's a writer and an author and so on. And his talk is going to be on the Civilian Conservation Corps, one of the great pieces of legislation by the FDR's New Deal, and closely related to this area because Paramarquette State Park is part of the CCC legacy. So I hope that you will come and visit us for that lecture in May, and we'll continue again next fall. We'll have more information about that later on. Again, I thank our sponsors, Liberty Bank, for helping us put this kind of a program together, our anonymous donors, and the board and membership of Historic Elsah Foundation. Keep in touch, become a member. On your phone, your tablet, or your computer, go to historicelsah.org. So now I'll take questions, Derek. Okay, I saw this one back here first.
Thanks, this was a great lecture. Thank you.
Do you want to take the microphone so that our people can hear? I think you can pull it out.
And you say your name is when you
Yeah, Tim, my name's Ryan. I just wanted to say thank you. By any chance, was Nike based in Pierre Marquette? Did that have an influence? Or if Nike was here during the time in the 50s, did that Air Force coming here influence a base to be built in Pierre Marquette?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to the question.
The answer is it wasn't there.
I mean,
In 1954, there was no threat at that point in time. The second would be it wasn't put in place until the 60s.
Yeah, but
Late 50s.
the follow-up was if it wasn't there, did the Air Force?
Ryan, stand up if you don't mind. Okay.
Yeah, so it was a two part. One wasn't there, so apparently it wasn't. So the second part was if it wasn't there, did the Air Force Academy, looking at this area, inspire there to be a base there by another branch?
Probably not, and it would be because the those Nike bases were, as I understand it, were sited around cities that could have been attacked by strategic bombers from Russia. So it wouldn't have been just here, but it would have been so many miles away from St. Louis. There would have been others around St. Louis, not just here.
There's another reason as well.
Okay, Richard, you have to stand.
As I understand it, one of the reasons why they put the Nike base up on the bluff is because they found they had to dig these big silos. And where they chose to do the Nike silos was perfect soil for that purpose. And overlook the city, of course.
And Richard is an authority. He has a book on Paramarquette State Park that's created by the Missouri Botanical Garden. He's been here at this lecture series a couple of times. Thank you, Richard. I appreciate it. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
Do they presume that if they bought all their land and obviously using eminent domain, that pretty much everything would have been torn down and rebuilt? Would that have been a safe assumption?
Yes, it's a safe assumption. If I understand your question, if they bought all of the land that I showed you on that map, and they took it over by eminent domain, whether they paid a fair price for it or not, it's not relevant. They bought all of the land, they owned it. Yes, they were going to tear everything down. There'd be no more, they wouldn't be made that building, there'd be more dwelling. Maybe there would be some. You don't know how to adapt or reuse, but I'll tell you one thing, Chautauqua would have disappeared.
Yeah.
Totally, because we were a bunch of cottages back in the 1950s. Janet Real.
Yes. Oh. So I agree, it was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. And I enjoyed how you gave a really big context for it, including the flights of fancy. That's really lovely. And then
I'm a flights of fancy God.
I know, I know, and that's one of the many things I appreciate what you do. So my main thought is, okay, so we have Chautauqua against it, Principia against it, Elsah against it also.
Yeah, well, I don't know.
Well, let's say it was, and
Local farmers were headed up by a guy named Joe Knight. If you're driving on 109 between 3 and Jerseyville, you see Knight Road. It starts off there and it tees into Salem Street. That's named for that guy.
so I have a small question and then a bigger one. So the small question, if all these people are against it, who wrote the RFP?
Good point. I have not read the RFP, and that's one of the things that I have every day I get a new bucket list. And so that's on my new bucket list, is to get a hold of that RFP and see exactly. But my guess is it's primarily the Alton Chamber of Commerce that is.
To be responded to.
Pardon?
The writing of it was done by the committee. The response to it would have been Alton or St. Louis or whatever. Request for proposals start at the government level and go out.
And she's asking who sent the response.
Yeah,
You ask who wrote it.
okay,
You write.
I think I asked the question wrong. What I am wanting to say is, I think what you're saying
Right.
is, who was it that responded to the RFP?
Yeah,
Thank you.
my guess is somewhere in the intricacies of that answer will be, you'll find the Alton Chamber of Commerce and other interested parties. The research I've done here, I have not been able, for example, I thought there'd be a ton of doctoral dissertations on this program, but I haven't been able to find that. And the larger question.
Okay, here's my larger question. If that would have happened, that it would have been built here and essentially subsume this whole area. So I'm thinking about pros and cons. Now, as you know, we have land adjacent to Lock Haven, not so far. And also
Yeah.
the Evergreen Heights, my great grandfather, E.A. Real estate. And we also have had land taken by eminent domain in order to build the river road. Our land went straight down to the river. But when I saw the picture in Colorado Springs, and then when I think, that would have been here, then even though we look at the population, I don't see that as a plus myself. But if we have had explosion of population here,
Well,
or because I think that what we have, because it's not here, we have the history, we have the natural beauty, and we have culture. And all of that would have been not here, or would have been erased, would have been destroyed, I think, had they come here. So personally, I am glad that they did not come here. So I'm wondering, because I'm so biased against it, besides population, economic, what would be the advantage? That
well, when I taught history, one of the things that I tried to impress on my students was that we all have a bias. And the story is called a frame of reference, but it's there, and it's not a pejorative term, you just have it. And when you're looking at something, you want to say, where's that person coming from? What's this all about? Janet is a landowner today, and her family was back in the 1950s. And
yes, since 1863, and yes.
a long time.
With happening.
And her land was not directly affected, but very close, very close. The reason I put up the statistical data is that it gives you an opportunity to make some inferences. The population of Colorado Springs being jumped by 10 times the population in 1950. That means more tax revenue, more business activity, more bigger museums. Museums are locating in Colorado Springs today because that's the place to be. And so, I think that's it. It would have been a dramatic change for this area, and not everybody was opposed to it. I mean, there were people who said, "Oh, we're going to lose a lot," but he's okay. So where are you coming from? Your land would have this off the cuff thought. Your land would have become enormously much more valuable because you'd be right next to the.
So as you say, it's a question of value. It's a question of moral values, really, and what you most care about. And so I think that's the interesting thing, like some Colorado Springs, they're going pros and cons, and they're saying, okay, we're gonna go for the American dream.
Yeah, and so, but the people in Colorado, the people making the decision, they really, when it comes down to it, perhaps you could say it wasn't that big a decision. Eisenhower was probably for it. According to this Principia article in the purpose, the Illinois Journal, Eisenhower is alleged to have had a conversation with I'll make it up, Kentucky or Tennessee congressman, who said to him, "Hey, Mr. President, did you ever make a decision that your wife was a real person behind it? I mean, did you? Did you?" And he, again, scratched his head and said, "Yeah, I did, one time." He wouldn't tell her what time. There's some good, interesting things. There's a lot of humor in some of this too. In the spring of 1954, the committee said, let's go with Colorado Springs. And somebody said, oh, it's got mountain air, it's thinner, it's going to be a problem for flying and so on. Let's go out and check. So remember, went out with two other the colleagues on the committee. They flew out to Colorado Springs. They go to the local airport. And they say, we want to rent a plane. And the guy says, who are you? We can't, you know, we don't just rent a plane to anybody. So Lindbergh, according to the anecdote, pulls out 10 licenses, you know, from the UK, from France, from Germany, from 5 or 6 different American states. And the guy at the airport says, oh, you're that guy. Thank you all for joining.